Anti-Semitism I find genuinely confusing.
Why?
Just the dynamics of it, the fact that even in the immediate aftermath of something like this, it is operative in the places that it's operative. I mean, again, at Harvard, at Stanford.
Sam, are you really confused about that?
Yeah.
Because Eric actually disagrees with me on this, and I want to hear what you have to say, because we had a private conversation about it that we didn't get to finish. But isn't this the thing that all four of us have been talking about and have been concerned about is woke, call it what you want, ideology, worldview, a set of disconnected slogans, whatever. The central core of it is oppressor-oppressed dynamics. And Jews, where do they land on that?
But not in this case. I mean, it's.
Oh no, it's the oppressor being slain by the oppressed is the argument, right? So it makes perfect sense that you'd celebrate that.
Yeah, it doesn't. Well, first of all,
within their system,
anti-Semitism was just as real, even in America, when the crematory of Auschwitz were still smoking. Right? I mean, literally, you have anti-Semitic speeches on the floor of the Senate. You read David Wyman's book, The Abandonment of the Jews. Right? It's just this catalog of kind of the ambient anti-Semitism in the U.S. during the Holocaust and after. So it's like just the durability of this animus, whether the Jews are on top or whether they're obviously on the bottom. I mean, literally, whether they're practically eradicated. I just find it. Yes, I understand its historical origins, and they are actually theological. I mean, so it is Christian and Muslim theology that cashes it out ultimately. But I just don't understand. There so many people are anti-Semitic and are interested in the idea that that there's some Jewish conspiracy that's controlling everything, and the Jews are like if you're very far on the right, the Jews are not white. So if you're a white supremacist, the Jews are not white, and therefore they're the object of your bigotry. But if you go far enough left, the Jews are extra white, extra privileged, and therefore they lose in this victimology game. It's just the fact that it's so well subscribed, whatever changes on the landscape, I find perplexing.
Thomas Sowell has a very good, sorry Francis, just this one bit, and then you go. He has a very good explanation. He has a chapter in Black Rednecks and White Liberals called Are Jews Generic? And he talks about middlemen minorities all over the world always finding themselves in this situation because of the role they fill in society, of the jobs that they do, being middlemen. They're simultaneously misunderstood by the larger society, and also...
This is the confusion that Kanye had about his agents and managers.
Pretty much.
Yeah. Where is Kanye, everybody?
He's our surprise guest.
If he was sitting here, this episode would get a lot more views, let's be honest.
But to me, it's anti-Semitism comes from a lack of control in people's lives. Now, if you look at, for instance, the far left, they would say the Jews are in control of the banking system. That's what the Jews control. If you look at the far right now, the new conspiracy theory is a great replacement theory. And what is that? The fact that the Jews are in control of Muslims coming to the West because they want to eradicate white people. I mean, it's obviously completely nonsensical, but this is what these people believe.
But there's so few Jews, and so that even in an area where they're massively overrepresented, right? I mean, even among Nobel laureates in physics, right? They're still a minority. They're not a majority of anything, and so the idea that they're in control is just.
It's moronic, but that's what these people believe, and they believe that that this group, because that's what a lot of conspiracy theories come down to. This group are in control, whether it's a World Economic Forum, whether it's Jewish people, but it's people who feel that they have no control. They have no control over their own lives. They are powerless. Therefore, somebody else must have the power. Therefore, it's Jewish people.
Go on. Speaking as a Jew,
do you understand it, Eric?
Well, better than this. Well,
What a loving insult.
not meant.
I'm kidding.
Yeah.
Go for it, please.
There's a spectrum of anti-Semitism, and we're talking about it. We're talking about the whole rainbow at the moment, and this sort of mutant rainbow has very different origins. So the reason calling it woke doesn't really point to the fact that it's revolutionary. It's violent revolutionary thinking. That's what's behind woke. The idea is we have a campaign, and our campaign is that oppression leads to poverty. So now you've got a real problem when you've got a very clearly oppressed group that is not poor, because that breaks the entire syllogism that is being used to sign people up. So the radical revolutionary left has to hate Jews because they are the counterexample that gives the lie to the entire program. And so that is why you have to have a position on the Jews from the revolutionary left.
Do they hate Japanese Americans as much?
Well, I was going to say overseas Chinese, Parsis,
but that's because they're middlemen minorities. That was my point.
We can come back to this, but
Okay.
I was going to say then on the right, you have a different situation. For example, people on the right who are I keep thinking about doing a show called My Friends the Anti-Semites, because I'm actually in dialogue with many of them, not to name names. And a lot of them are very supportive, in fact, of Israel right now, because their issue is who came up with ethno-nationalism? That Swedes caring about Sweden is ethno-nationalism? F you. People have a right to be in their country without somebody saying, oh, that's just blood and soil like from the Nazis. So their feeling is, how can you have a state that is got a Jewish star on its flag and not bring up ethno-nationalism? So these are the people that crowd your Twitter comments with, for me, but not for thee. That's their line. So their feeling is, hey, you should go defend yourself and get these killers, and you should go back home to Israel where you belong, right? And so that's totally different than the left-wing thing. But now the question has to do with a word that needs to be taken out of our vocabulary, which is underrepresented. Now, underrepresented, we talk about an underrepresented minority. I don't know why somebody's underrepresented. Between 1987 and the start of the Boston Marathon in 1897, I don't think there were any Kenyans or Ethiopians who won the Boston Marathon. And then after 1987, it's basically straight Kenyan, Ethiopian, occasionally a Japanese guy. Are Kenyans and Ethiopians overrepresented? Are the rest of us underrepresented? Well, you're holding a competition that's basically anybody can start, anybody can finish, and some people seem to be better than others. All right, now if you look at the so-called JQ, which is the Jewish question, why are there so many Jews in all of these powerful positions? If you believe in proportional representation, then Jews are overrepresented. And so if you believe in underrepresented minorities, you have to get rid of the overrepresented minority. So these are all these language traps and language games. And people fear, how can there be a people that look more or less like they're of European descent, who often have names that don't tell you who they are, like McCormick or something like that, who are privately subscribed to some sort of secret rhizome in a world in which nothing adds up. So particularly right now, anti-Semitism is always going to get bad when people can see that they're being lied to at scale. I don't care who's doing the lying at scale, the Jews will be assumed to be behind it.
Yeah, that part is mysterious to me. I mean, that could just be legacy code. We had the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and then that just got grandfathered in so people resort to that. But the idea that would be the story that everyone reverts to.
Say more.
Like why the Jews under those conditions? You say you said it was just as though we could just assume this.
If you
makes
look
sense.
at, for example, who founded Facebook and who founded Google, right? Tech giants. You've got Jews in both situations. If you imagine, okay, so our electronic communication with each other is largely mediated, our ability to search, for example. So if I put in American inventors and only black faces come up at Google, I know that somebody's put code in there to make it appear that most of the inventors in American history are black. Who would do such a thing? Like it's such an obvious bad faith thing to do on a search engine. And then, of course, it's going to be, well, it's Larry Page and Sergey Brin, or if Mark Zuckerberg doesn't allow a story to circulate or whatever. And so in part, and by the way, you may start to see this with Indian Americans. There's this very quiet, to use the vernacular of our day, Indian Americans are having a moment. And you're suddenly going to realize that you don't understand what's going on with the BJP. You don't know who the Shiv Sena are. You have no idea what Indian Americans care about, and suddenly they're in all these powerful political positions. So when you have a powerful minority, and particularly one that's visually indistinguishable from others, there's always going to be a fear that because you have high-ranking people in media, banking, universities, all of these, fantastically successful Jewish populations are always going to be on the hook for the fact that people can see that their information is distorted.
And why are Jews successful, Eric?
Well, the old answer I gave Joe Rogan when he asked me about why 1% of the world's population would get 25% of the physics Nobel Prize is that we cheated physics. But nobody believes that. I think one way of answering this question is, I don't know. I don't know why 99 of the top 100 chess players in open competition are male. It feels like a trap to answer the question. I would say that our culture is very clear that if we want to survive, we have to do really, really well and we have to contribute back. So as a diaspora culture, in part, our strategy is over succeed, over contribute to your host society. Otherwise, we can't make our equation work. So in part, it's a question of anthropics. You're only asking the supposed JQ because there are still Jews after this many thousand years, and the strategy works. And just go, if you're in the U.S., for example, go look at who donated the wings of your local hospitals and tell me what the last names are, and I guarantee you that some of them are going to be Jewish, no matter where you are. So in part, this is how we live. We live by being a net benefit to the societies in which we reside. And we drive ourselves incredibly hard, knowing that we're always going to be fighting anti-Semitism. So the example I was going to give is during COVID, I didn't understand that our family's reaction was use the time indoors to learn as much as you can, push yourself as hard as you possibly can, would be badly received in the outside world, which is like, of course you're doing that because you're in a position of privilege. And you just have this attitude of, for F's sake, if you want to look at a similar culture, there's a female comedian named Zarna Garg who is explaining sort of the Indian tiger mom approach to parenting her own children. You cannot major in history, you can't major in art, you're going to major in computer science. This sort of drive to excel and succeed is very, very costly. And I understand a culture that doesn't push their kids as hard. But to be honest, if the Jews are going to survive, they have to compete. They have to do very, very well in the competition, and they have to give back. And anyone who attempts to talk about proportional representation is fundamentally messing with the Jewish equation for survival. If we cannot compete, succeed, and give back, we have a serious problem as Jews.
What about IQ?
What about it?
I have heard that different groups have different IQs.
I've heard the same thing.
And Ashkenazi Jews, I have heard, have a higher IQ than the average.
No offense to that. I think what you really want to say is there anything to Jewish genetics? And gosh, I would hope so. because otherwise we don't know anything about genetics. Why can I spit in a tube and it tells me what my belief structure is and what language I pray on Friday night? It's, clearly it's both a genetic group and a belief structure that have co-traveled. But for IQ, I always find this really strange. IQ is just not that interesting in the upper reaches. So I'm totally up for believing that Jews have a genetic advantage, but I don't think that a few extra IQ points accounts for the level of creativity and the level of contribution. I think IQ is really powerful below 100. It's much less powerful above 100. This is sort of something that Nassim Taleb and I have discussed. The fetish about the fact that it's measurable causes this real problem because it's a nightmare indicator. It's good enough to suggest that something is very real, that can be tracked, that has a genetic component, but it's not good enough to explain creativity. And I think that, for example, if I talk to my East Asian friends, a lot of them are confused, and they say things like, where does Jewish creativity come from? We also are supposed to have very high IQs, and we're still in a leader-follower mode. How is it that we get into this Jewish creativity mode? So I happen to think that because people are dissuaded from talking about IQ, because they're dissuaded from talking about genetics, they want to focus on IQ as if it is intelligence, which it definitely is not. It's a component, it's related to intelligence, but it isn't. And then you have this problem, which is that in some sense, what really matters is the creativity that co-travels. And how much of that is genetic, I don't know. But it's not a terrible thing to say that people are genetically different and that there are trade-offs. The Jewish contribution to the National Basketball Association has been pretty meager.
Eric, do you think...
I blame anti-Semitism.
Rampant.
Yeah. Do you think it's also the fact that Jews have always tended to be outsiders? And when you're an outsider of a group, you're always looking in, which means that it tends towards being creative, because then what you are doing is you're reflecting the society in a way that people who are a member of the in-group simply cannot. There's a lot of people who say comedians tend to be outsiders. Comedians are the ones who are reflecting what is happening to the society. And Jews and comedy, I mean, they go together pretty well.
Trauma, and Jews. I mean, it's a perfect combination. Yeah. I don't think that works because, like, Roma would be outsiders to society, and I don't think you've seen the same sorts of behavior patterns.
Having taught the Roma, having spent a lot of time teaching Roma, they are much more they're segregated. They're not really part of society in the way that Jews are.
There's also a lot of creativity in that culture, but without the same, in-system accomplishment. I think that Jews tend to be in-system. They tend to work within the structures that they find. And, my wife being from the Jewish community of India, I have an opportunity to see a very different world about, the impact of let's just say, the Sassoon family, or the way that the Parsis mirror the Jews inside of an Indian context. So I think that, I don't know why we're afraid of talking about genetics and cognitive ability. I don't know why we're afraid of talking about culture and cognitive ability. I don't know why we're afraid of talking about culture and drive together. But the world is not uniform. And there is a Jewish strategy. The great part of the Jewish strategy is that most of it is pretty much open source. And if you want to push your children really, really hard to survive, and if you want to tell them you've got a dragon with fire, breathing fire down the back of your neck because you've always been oppressed and you'll never know when you have to leave very quickly on short notice, you can duplicate the Jewish experience. And good luck.